Hello everyone, this is Myron and I've got another video about unobtainable items in Minecraft 1.12.2. Today we are talking about large fern items because in the past I've made many videos about explaining how to get unobtainable items which come from blocks in Minecraft 1.12.2, and I gave you all the items which come from blocks in 1.12.2 except for large ferns, and now in this video we will be closing the gap and will explain how you can get large fern items and also how you can get all other falling blocks which we weren't able to get before. Like the old method I showed only works for blocks which can survive block updates while they have blocks underneath them. But they don't work for things like saplings or whetstone dust or things which need ground underneath to survive. And with this you can then complete your falling block collection. Something I should mention about large fern items is in 1.14 plus and all like new versions, large fern items are not unobtainable. They generate naturally in village chests. It's only in old versions like 1.12.2 and earlier that large fern items are unobtainable. So it's that's also one of the reasons why I didn't make videos about it before, but we are now completing it. So if you want to get a full falling block collection in 1.12.2, you need to use these new methods. So in the previous videos I showed the old piston clock generic method, and it's the recommended thing for command blocks, structure blocks, and all the interesting unobtainable items. And in this video we show a new generic method which works best for all the uninteresting unobtainable items like large ferns and silverfish stone and so on, because the new method only works for blocks which you can easily create. So like the new method does not work for command blocks. If you want to have command block items, you need to use all generic methods which I showed in falling block episode 6. This is now a new method which just works if you want a complete falling block collection and you want to get falling blocks which don't work with the old one. And also the new method is much simpler and less crashy than the old method. So like if you want to get the hard unobtainable items, you have to do the hard method with save states, async chunk loading, terrain population, instant tile ticks, async observer line, word tearing, and falling block swap. While the new method only uses save state, async chunk loading, and falling block swaps, and it doesn't use any instant tile ticks, and it doesn't use any async observer line. So it's much simpler, and the new method could be improved with cluster chunks, but I haven't included cluster chunks, even though cluster chunks would help a lot with the new method. The setup in this video needs a few hours of AFK time per falling block, so it's very slow, but you can just build it up and then you can just run it on your server, and then you will get like a few falling blocks per day. But if you used cluster chunks, then it would be actually able to compete in terms of speed with the other generic method. It's just that without cluster chunks, this is very slow. So I will quickly talk about the history of falling blocks and large fern items. In 2017, Coolman first had the theoretical idea that maybe we could get unobtainable items using falling block swaps. And then he, for several years, just tried to get any setup working with this idea. And in 2020, he made a big breakthrough because he got the first setup which does chunk swaps and falling block swaps. And it was a very weird setup because it was in the end and used true void chunks, and like his goal was to get end portal frame items, but like obviously you can't easily get end portal frame blocks in the end. So this was a very weird setup because it was very far away from end portal frame items. So after he made this first proof of concept setup, after that all the research went into how can we do the same thing but in the overworld or never dimension, and they didn't really pursue this thing in the end further, even though it was really, really elegant. But like they just didn't care about the end. And then like in 2022, falling block research had progressed to a point where we could do falling block swaps in the overworld, and then like we did all this stuff with the end portal frame items and the command block items and the generic method and so on. And the old setup from Coolman, which was this weird thing in the end, was like forgotten because this was not what people cared about. But then came the question with large fern items. Because people then ask, how can we get large fern items if the usual generic method doesn't allow us to get large fern items? And people made very complicated setups, and what I want to do in this video is basically return to the old Coolman setup in the end and just make it survival friendly and more efficient, and that's how I came to my setup. But before I came to my setup, people were thinking about falling large fern items, and JKM made in July 2022 a first theoretical concept for getting large fern items, and it was like one of the most complicated things you can do at all. Like you start a falling block code on the async thread, So like you first get an async observer line. When this async observer line updates a sand block, and while you are in the middle of a sand code, you start another terrain population and slow down the terrain population. And when you're in the middle of falling block code for like several minutes, and then the player can just walk to the position where the sand block was and destroy it and place a large fern there. And if you then interrupt the async delay, then the async thread continues the falling block code and then creates a falling large fern. So it's really, really clever and so on, but it's really, really complicated to actually pull off. And JKM didn't make a full setup, but it was like supported by command blocks at a few points. It was just a proof of concept thing. But even though this was a like really complicated method, there are actually people who did it in survival, namely in January 2024, the Leafcraft server, which is some Japanese server, obtained the large fern item using JKM's complicated method. And then after that, there were people trying to make slightly simpler methods. So there's Lucas Wills, who also created a method for getting large fern items, and it's simpler than JKM's methods, but it's still more complicated than the usual piston clock generic methods, which we use for command block items and so on. So like at this point, it was still the case that large fern items was basically the most difficult thing you could get, and it was more difficult than command blocks. And Lucas Wills' method was basically that he did a falling block swap by doing an unload chunk swap at the same time. So you first get async observer lines, and then you have like one thread update sand, and another thread does an unload chunk swap in the same position at the same time. And you have a chunk save set it so that after the chunk swap you load in a new version of the chunk, and then you can do a falling block swap. And now we come to my setup, and my setup basically takes the very old setup which Kuhlmann showed in 2020 and tries to optimize it. So I'm back in the end. I'm using true void chunks to do rehash chunk swaps, but but it's in many ways much simpler because it doesn't use a lot of the stuff which was introduced afterwards. And it's very interesting because it uses no instant tile ticks and no async observer lines, and it doesn't even use terrain population. So since it's based on these very early things, it manages to be much simpler. So it's the historical motivation. So here's an overview of different generic methods. So I call a method generic if it works for almost everything, and I call a method general if it works for everything. And here we can see different generic methods and general methods, and after them I showed whether they work for command blocks and large ferns. So in 2020 we get the Kuhlmann setup in the end. The Kuhlmann setup is not 100% survival friendly. It used instant tile ticks in the end. But it allows you to get falling blocks from general blocks, like large fern items you could get with a Kuhlmann end setup if it just was survival friendly. While you can't really get command block items with a Kuhlmann setup, because how do you even get command blocks in the end? It's a bit unclear. Then in 2022 we have a piston clock generic method, which works for command blocks and the structure blocks and all the stuff people actually care about. And then in 2022 we have JKM's general method, which his setup was not 100% survival friendly, but it was a very good theory, and it works for large fern items and command blocks. And then we have Leafcraft actually implementing JKM's method in survival, and this is probably the most complicated falling block thing anyone has ever done in survival, I would guess. And then afterward we have Lucas' general method, which is simpler than JKM thing, but more complicated than piston clock. And now we have Myron instant tile tickless generic method, which is much simpler than all the other stuff, and is just slightly more complicated than the Kuhlmann setup in the end. So here we are at the contraption. This here is the player platform. To turn on the contraption, you flick this lever. Like currently it's turned on. Like if it's off, it looks like this. And if you flick the lever down when the contraption is turned on. While the contraption is turned on, you should always stay in the chunk of player platform. So always stay in this chunk. And you need to have view distance 2. If your view distance is larger than 2, then the whole thing won't work. And then what you do is you wait for several hours, and after several hours, then maybe there's a falling large fern item, falling large fern appearing here. So when a large fern arrives, then it looks like this, like the large fern will come from the contraption over there and then be launched over here. And once you have it here, then you can use a fishing rod and pull it upwards, and then you have the large fern item. And yeah. Okay, and now let's turn off the contraption and actually look at it. I have view distance 2 now, so I don't see much, but the main contraption is over here. So this right here is where the actual contraption is. The most important chunk in the contraption is this chunk right here. This is the glass chunk. The glass chunk is called the glass chunk because it has this stained glass block in it. The stained glass block can be used to start an async thread, the stained glass thread. And with the stained glass thread, we can do chunk swaps with this chunk. And we can also do falling block swaps. So there's also 576 concrete powder in here, and with these we try to do falling block swaps. Other than the glass chunk, we also have a void chunk over here. When you build this contraption, there's only one thing that you need to pay attention to, and that is that you never place any blocks inside the void chunk, and that you also never let any block light get into the void chunk. So you need to make sure that you don't place any torches nearby. So if I were to place like a block right here, then this contraption would be broken forever and cannot be repaired again. So you need to make sure that you never place any blocks in there. And also, if you place a torch like nearby here, like if I were to place a torch here, then some of the light would get into this chunk, and then this chunk would also be broken forever. This needs to be a true void chunk. It needs to have 0 chunk sections, and that's the only thing you need to pay attention to when you build this. Other than that, you can just build everything normally. You can just paste in the schematic, and you don't need to worry about unpopulated chunks or ungenerated chunks or anything. Other than that, you can just build everything as in the world download. The only other thing you need to pay attention to is that you build it as the exact same location. Like you cannot move this thing around. Like this needs to be, at least the glass chunk needs to be as exactly this location, and you cannot choose a different location. The only thing I should mention is if you are in a world where you have at some point placed blocks in this chunk at this location, then you cannot use this chunk as the void chunk anymore. Then you need to use some different chunk. We are just a few hundred blocks away from the main end island, so there are a lot of completely empty chunks around here, and then you can just choose a different one and it should still work. So the most important chunks in the contraption are firstly the player platform, because there's a lever to turn on the contraption. Then we have the glass chunk, which is where everything happens, and the glass chunk needs to be at a very specific position because it needs to have a hash value of 256 in the size 512 chunk hash map. And then we have the void chunk. When you build it, never place any blocks in the void chunk. Never also keep light out of the void chunk, and maybe also keep non-player entities out of it. Just keep it clean. And then there's also the stall chunk directly next to the void chunk. This is a chunk which we will load just to create lag. And the stall chunk needs to have a similar amount of data as the glass chunk. So in the glass chunk we will have some safe state books. So in the stall chunk you also place some safe state books, just slightly less. And this will just be a chunk which is important for manipulating the race condition later. So those are the most important chunks. Okay, so what are we even trying to do? We are trying to do falling block swaps without using tile ticks. Now, to perform a falling block swap in general, you always need 2 threads, and one of the threads is executing falling block code, and the other thread is replacing the falling block by a different block, and then you get a falling block of the new block that you placed. Now, if instant tile ticks are off, then the only way you can execute falling block code is if you are the main thread and you're in the tile tick phase. That's the only thing which can execute falling block code. So if we want to do a falling block swap, then the async thread needs to replace our block by a different block. And the most general way to do this is to do a chunk swap. We will use an async thread and will load an already loaded chunk, but the new version of the chunk we load will be different than the old version, and then some blocks get replaced by the new blocks. And the type of chunk swap we use is something called a rehash chunk swap. In my past videos, I only talked about unload chunk swaps. Like there are two big kinds of chunk swaps. There are rehash chunk swaps and unload chunk swaps, and in the past I've talked about unload chunk swaps, but in this video we talk about rehash chunk swaps. And if you want to get very detailed explanation of rehash chunk swaps, you can read a document by Kuhlman called Minecraft Homework, where he goes very in depth about how to perform about how a rehash chunk swap works in the code. I will not go as in depth as this document, but here are the basics about rehash chunk swaps. So loaded chunks are stored in a hashmap, which hashmap has a size. The size of a hashmap is a power of 2. So whenever you load a chunk, you put it into a hashmap, and if the hashmap is more than 3/4 filled, then it upsizes to the next power of 2. So for example, if we have a hashmap of size 256 and we load 193 chunks, then the hashmap upsizes to 512. This is, by the way, exactly what we do in the contraption. In the contraption, we always load 192 chunks. When we start the glass thread, when we load the void chunk is the 193rd chunk, and then it upsizes, and then we can get a rehash chunk swap something. If a hashmap is less than 3/16 filled, then it downsizes to the previous power of 2. And if one thread resizes the chunk hashmap while another thread is looking for a chunk in the chunk hashmap, then the other thread can fail to find the chunk sometimes. The contraption also includes this chunk loading grid. This chunk loading grid loads exactly 192 chunks. It doesn't matter which chunks you load, it just matters how many you load, because we want to do a chunk hash map upsize when the load chunk gets loaded, and for that we need to load like a very specific amount of chunks before that. Yeah, and that's just what this chunk loading grid is for. When we talk about rehash chunk swaps, there's a big difference between rehash chunk swaps without cluster chunks and rehash chunk swaps with cluster chunks. In my contraption, I did rehash chunk swaps without cluster chunks because I'm lazy. Rehash chunk swaps without cluster chunks can only be done at very specific positions. Namely, they can only be done in chunks which have a hash value of n after upsizing the hash map size to 2n. So if you, in our contraption, you use an upsize from 256 to 512, and that can only be done at locations which have a hash value of 256 in the 512 hash map. At all other locations, rehash chunk swaps either just don't work, in the sense that async thread trying to find a chunk always finds the chunk when you upsize it. Or there are some locations where if an async thread tries to find a chunk while the main thread is upsizing it, the async thread gets an array index out of bounds exception and dies. So like only at very specific locations are rehash chunk swaps possible, and at all other locations it either doesn't work or it crashes. While with cluster chunks you can do rehash chunk swaps almost everywhere, but you need to figure out how rehash chunk swaps with cluster chunks works, and I have never done that myself, but if you do want to do research into rehash chunk swaps with cluster chunks, then I can give you some good news. Namely, there is a cluster chunk finder for rehash chunk swaps by Cheater Codes, which is a very old school fallen block researcher. And if you want to understand it, then you can look at this cluster chunk finder. So that's what rehash chunk swaps are. Now, how do we do fallen block swaps without instant tile ticks? So we do the following. So the way this contraption works is right here we have a dragon egg. Over here we have the void chunk. And over here we have falling blocks. Those are the three important ingredients. What we do is we retract this piston, and also we extend these pistons and push these falling blocks over into a position where the large ferns are. And we also save state the chunks. Let me quickly save state the chunks. So here we have save state books. And on disk, the chunk looks exactly like this. Like the chunk which is on disk has the large ferns right here. But if we activate these pistons, then we can get this concrete powder into the position where the large fern was. So the chunk which is currently here has this concrete powder here, but the chunk which is saved to disk has large ferns here. So if we were to reload the chunk which is on disk, then it would replace this concrete powder by a large fern. Okay. What we do is we push this over, we retract this piston so that the dragon egg schedules a tile tick, and we also schedule a tile tick on this comparator right here. And then these three things will be executed in the same game tick, and what we will get in one game tick is first this dragon egg falls down, secondly this comparator activates and loads the void chunk, and the third thing is these falling blocks execute the tile tick and start falling down. So these are the three things which happen in one game tick. And what the async thread then does is when this dragon egg destroys the stained glass, then the async thread will start and will start looking at all these beacons down here. Then the second thing is the main thread starts loads the void chunk, and when the main thread loads the void chunk, then it can happen that the async thread fails to find this glass chunk when it tries to check for beacons, and then the async thread will start loading the glass chunk again. And then the third thing we do is we process these falling block tile ticks which you have over here, and we hope that these falling block tile ticks get processed while the async thread finishes loading the glass chunk. And if this happens, then what we hope happens is that when this falling block gets replaced by a large fern while we execute this, and if this happens, then the large fern will fall down. And then it will get pushed over by these pistons, and then the falling large fern lands over here at the player platform. First, we let our dragon egg in lazy chunks fall and destroy a stained glass block. After that, we start loading the void chunk within the same tile tick phase. And loading the void chunk will upsize the chunk hash map. And we also make it so that after we load the void chunk, the glass chunk turns into an entity processing chunk. because you see here at the beginning we want to destroy a stained glass block, and for that we want to use a dragon egg and lazy chunks. But down here we want to do falling block swap, so we want falling blocks to do normal falling. And for that reason we need to turn the glass chunk into an entity processing chunk after we started the glass thread, but before we do the falling block swaps. And for that reason we make it so that the void chunk is within the 5x5 grid of the glass chunk, and then the glass chunk can turn into an entity processing chunk while we load the void chunk. It's super clever, and it's like, my setup is really genius, right? Okay. Okay. And then while the chunk hashmap upsizes, we hope that the async glass thread doesn't find the glass chunk. If that happens, then the async glass thread will load the glass chunk again, even though it's already loaded. And we save state the glass chunk in such a way that it loads in a different version of the chunk. And after that, we do this after in the same tile tick phase, we will execute the tile ticks of like several hundred falling blocks. And we hope that the async glass thread finishes the chunk loading while we are executing this tile tick. So now the setup is very hardware dependent, and you need maybe to adjust the setup to your hardware, because otherwise it might not work on your computer. And to adjust the setup to your hardware, I wrote a modded server jar, which you can download in the video description. And that modded server jar will help you adjust this the setup to your hardware. So the way this works is there are two things we need to adjust. We need to adjust the chunk swaps, and we need to adjust the falling block swaps. And to adjust the chunk swaps, at the player platform there is a place where you can place redstone torches and sand. And the tile ticks of these redstone torches and sand will be executed after the stained glass thread starts, but before the void chunk gets loaded. And then you can fine-tune the delay at which the void chunk gets loaded. And the important thing are the redstone torches. The sand makes so little delay that it doesn't really matter. The redstone torches are the really important part. So I will now activate the contraption, and then I will wait a little bit. And after that I will look at what the server prints out. Server prints out autosaves. It prints out when glass threads start and stop, and it prints out when the void chunk loads too early or too late. And if I now wait a little bit, then every 1.5 minutes this thing will do one attempt to get to do a chunk swap and do falling block swaps. Okay, and now here it did one attempt. So void chunk loaded after 7 async get block states. This is good. Like I've already optimized the delays, and I got a chunk swap, but the falling block swap started too late. So I don't need to add or remove any redstone torches, but I might need to remove some furnaces from the stall chunks. Okay, but if a server console were to say that the void chunk loaded too late, then you would need to add some sand or add some torches here. Like I would first add or remove torches, and only after that consider adding or removing sand. But that's how you adjust the delays for the void chunk. You just add or remove torches. And if you want to adjust the chance of falling block swaps, you go to the stall chunk. After every successful chunk swap, the profiler server tells you whether you have too many furnaces or not enough furnaces, and then you can add or remove furnaces there. And if you then get an optimal furnace amount, then you might start seeing some falling blocks. So that's how you adjust it to your hardware. And if you want to adjust the delay for the falling block swaps, what you do is you turn off a contraption, and then you go to the stall chunk. The stall chunk is right here. Let me quickly teleport up. This right here is the stall chunk, and the stall chunk has furnaces in it, and you can adjust the delay, which how long it takes to load the stall chunk, by adding or removing furnaces. So right now the server console told me that I have too many furnaces in my stall chunk. So if I want to improve my falling block swap chances, what I can do is I can remove a bunch of furnaces, and if I try it again, then I will have better success chances at the falling block swap. So that's how you adjust the thing to your hardware. And once the torch and furnace amounts are good, then every chunk swap attempt should have a roughly 1 in 10 chance to be a successful chunk swap, and every successful chunk swap should have a 1 in 10 chance of producing a falling large fern. So you, at every 1.5 minutes you should have a 1 in 100 chance of getting like a falling large fern. But this is like only after you adapted the setup to your hardware. So that's that. Okay, now you might ask what happens if I want to get other falling blocks than just large ferns, and the answer is you just replace the large ferns in the contraption by other blocks. You need to make sure that the pistons stay budded, but that's something you can just figure out with basic redstone skills. If other block you want is kind of a plant-like item, which can get random ticked, but which can be placed in farmland, then you should place it on top of farmland. Farmland has the nice thing that it's not a full hitbox, So if you do a falling block swap at this position, when the falling block doesn't instantly land again, but it actually falls down for one game tick, and then I have time to pull out the farmland with a piston. Well, if you put a dirt block there, then the falling block would instantly land again after the falling block swap, which is not what we want. Yeah, but you can just place other plants there. If you want to get something like a comparator, which requires a solid top surface underneath it, then you need to do update suppression to create a floating comparator. That's not very convenient, but that's how this setup works. And then thirdly, if you want to get like immovable blocks like obsidian, then you need to replace some of the pistons by headless pistons so that you can delete the obsidian block. But honestly, if you want to get immovable blocks, then you can just use the old piston block generic method instead of this thing. And finally, I want to announce that I now have a Patreon account, and if you want to give me money, you can now give me money. That's everything. Bye.